Welcome, those of you who are logged in again. You can send questions, just like Nicholas does from the Chicago area. The question is, who is the Gospel of Mark written to, the Jews or the Gentiles? And then a further question, is Mark the first Gospel written? These are some of my Sunday Bible class questions at my church. Great questions. And they are questions, again, which, as I already implied, we don't have a firm answer, so we have to put some things together and make some assumptions. Now, typically, first of all, the assumption on the Gospel of Mark, and I think it's a pretty safe assumption, is that it was John Mark who actually wrote the Gospel, and there's only one, he doesn't give an autograph, he gives a little hint in the Gospel of John, and that's about a young man who fled away and lost his robe in running. And we believe that that is a reference, a self-portrait, if you will, not the most flattering one, for the author of the book, John Mark. And now, the question, however, is who's it written to? Was it written to Jews or was it written to Gentiles? And is Mark the first gospel written? I think that there is good evidence that it was the first gospel written. It is the shortest of the gospels, as you know. It is a play-by-play gospel almost, in that it just says he did this and he did this and he did this and he did this. It's a chronology of sorts. And the most common word in the Gospel of Mark, if you look at it and go down the beginning of each verse, you'll see that almost every verse begins with and. It is almost even a bullet list kind of a gospel. Now, I do think that there's probable evidence that he wrote it first, and John Mark, associated, of course, with Paul and with Silas and the missionary work that had been done, and even associated all the way back into Jerusalem, there is evidence that he came to the point of realizing, under the power, might even say control of the Holy Spirit, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to write these things down. Then Matthew came along, and Luke came along, and they added to, and they wrote down their own versions of what had taken place. And both Mark and Luke, of course, were associates of the apostles, Matthew being an apostle himself. But Mark, again, we think was there and present for much of this, though he was a very young man. And it may have been even his home that was the upper room. And the upper room is just the term for the guest quarters upstairs. And it may have been his home downstairs. So very likely, Mark had lots of association with what he was writing, and he knew all the players involved to be able to ask them the questions and do the interviews. And then, of course, he was under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, all of that said, I think probably he did write it first. Now, who did he write it to? Did he write it to Jews or Gentiles? And the answer there is we don't really know. He doesn't claim a specific audience, and really it could have been either one, and probably the best is just to say both. There's not a slant one way or the other. I don't think that says, oh, this is definitely to the Gentiles, or this is definitely to the Jews. Now, most people will say that Mark was written to Greeks, and they get that just because of much of the I think they get it for two reasons. One is he was associated with Paul and Silas and the Gentiles out there in mostly the Greek world, and so it would make sense to say, well, he's writing it to the Greeks. But even if you begin to look, for example, if we look at Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger. That he doesn't give much intro there. He doesn't give much insight there to a Gentile who may not understand Jesus Messiah, Son of God, the prophets. He's got a lot of Judaism just right there in the first two verses. So I think that if he's writing to Gentiles that have some understanding of Judaism. I would say he's writing just really to the believers in Jesus Messiah and those who want to know more about Jesus Messiah. I don't know that it benefits us to narrow the audience as we have in some other books. For example, James says, I'm writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. We know that, and so we can use that as an interpretive grid. Since Mark doesn't do that, I think we're probably a little dangerous to do that. Now, that one reason then why it's typically said he wrote to the Greeks or to the Gentiles is because of his associations. But I think there's another reason, and that is because it is said that Matthew was written to the Jews, and I think Matthew does have the slant towards proving Jesus as king of the Jewish empire, as the rightful heir of the Jewish throne. And so his is much more Jewish in nature in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. So they assume then, well, Mark's got his view and Luke's got his view and John's got his view. And I think especially the synoptics, you can look at them and say, yeah, Matthew is a little more Jewish and Luke's a little more towards Theophilus, the lover of God, is how that translates. And Mark, they just have to almost have to make stuff up to come up with this. And so I just don't know that it has that much value, honestly, in that. So good question. Hopefully I answered that. Glad that you're in a church that has a Bible class that actually studies the Bible. Too many churches with Bible classes are studying books by Tim Keller or by John Piper or by Mark Batterson or some other preacher around. And I think even if the book was by Randy White, a Bible study class ought to be studying the Bible. And so I am very glad to hear that.